Alright, what's going on, guys? Elden Ring lore, perhaps more so than any of the past From Software games, is littered in mysteries and uncertainties. There's so many puzzles within this story that rely on connections that extend further than just what the game tells us. And personally, I think that's what makes it so much fun to discuss. So that's what we're gonna do today. Today we're gonna tackle one of these great questions in the lore and address a topic that I feel isn't discussed nearly enough, and that is the Two Fingers. Quite possibly the most mysterious character in the entire game. We're gonna discuss everything we know about them, all the factual information, and then delve into wild speculation territory to try and figure out exactly what they are. But as we get into that today, you guys know we're chasing down 100k subs here on the channel, getting closer and closer by the day. So if you want to stay up to date on all the latest Elden Ring and From Software news, and enjoy diving into the mysteries of the game's story, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It's a win-win for both of us. To begin our discussion today, I want to go over all the known information about the Two Fingers, the things that the game actually tells us. Right off the bat, we know that they are vassals of the Greater Will, able to consult the Greater Will and pass along its messages, which are thereby translated by the finger reader Crones. The Two Fingers heirloom tells us, fingers cannot speak, yet these are eloquent. Persistently they wriggle, spelling out mysteries in the air. Thus did we gain the words of our faith. So that tells us a few things about them, notably that something is speaking through them, and that the words they give are sacred and holy, specifically words of faith. And these words, although communicated without speaking, can seemingly be referenced by the Two Fingers prayer book, which depicts a sort of weird alphabet constructing two circles. We can also see this on the sigil that appears whenever casting these prayers. It can also be seen in a number of other places, including the wet blades, and more interestingly, two weapons such as the Cipher Pata and the Coded Sword, where the language itself bears a physical manifestation and deals holy damage. But the existence of these weapons raises a few interesting questions. It describes this language as a cipher or a code, meaning that it's obscured for a reason, only meant to be read by those who can decipher it. So we must ask if this message is that of the fingers themselves or the Greater Will being interpreted. The description of the Coded Sword reads, "Hidden sword once granted to the Tarnished of the Round Table Hold, by the Two Fingers. A formless cipher comprises its blade, which deals holy damage no shield can repel. Champions would gather at the Round Table Hold in days long past, when the Two Fingers were masters of oration, their flesh yet full of vigor." And there's actually a lot to glean from that description. The first of which is that these weapons themselves were distributed by the Two Fingers, not the Greater Will. So that would suggest that this alphabet is the language of the fingers. It reminds me in a sense of how Revelation describes the words of Jesus as a sword, perhaps taking that as a literal inspiration for these weapons. There are also the Confessors, who are described as being assassins who use the cover of darkness to hunt down the enemies of the Two Fingers, which gives a pretty sinister image of the fingers themselves. But in addition to that, they were also described as masters of oration. I assume back in a time whenever they were much more active and would offer consistent guidance to those at the Round Table Hold. And on a physical level, it describes that during that time, their flesh was full of vigor. Clearly, that time is not now, as we can see they're covered in wrinkles, sores, and wounds. What exactly caused their degradation we don't know for sure. I assume the shattering would be a good guess, but we're never explicitly told. To me, they almost seem like TV antennas tuned into the signal of the Greater Will far beyond, much like how Goldmask uses his fingers and arms to communicate the message of the Golden Order. We do actually see them interpret one message throughout the game, congratulating us after obtaining the first Great Rune. After welcoming the player as a shard bearer, they give us a little bit of background information and encourage us to seek out more. Another notable aspect of what the fingers actually do are the finger maidens who serve the Two Fingers by aiding the Tarnished on their journey, escorting them on their endeavor to become Elden Lord. Beyond the Tarnished though, Ranni tells us that the fingers also have the power to choose Empyreans, candidates to succeed Queen Marika and become the next god. So when it comes to the actual lore in the game, the fingers are described very powerfully, but when we actually journey through the game, that's not the picture we get at all. Throughout the entire game, they move one time, and then continue to stay stationary even when the Erd Tree is burned. So it makes us question, were they ever actually powerful at all? We'll come back to that in a little bit. Let's take a moment now and analyze their physical appearance. Throughout the game, we can see 4 different variations of the fingers. We have the living Two Fingers of the Round Table Hold, Ranni's Two Fingers that are mutilated and misshapen, the dead Two Fingers at the tops of the Divine Towers, and then of course the 3 fingers of the Frenzied Flame. We've already discussed the ones at the Hold, so let's move on to the ones in the Divine Towers. These fingers have several notable differences from the ones in the Round Table Hold. Firstly, they appear appear to be dead. They're no longer standing straight up, but are laying down in a sort of crawling position. And while the fingers that are alive in the hold seem to be made of flesh, the fingers in the Divine Towers appear to be made of wood. Now we'll talk about why exactly they're made of wood in a little while. Well, we can address two main points here. Number one, that the fingers on top of the Divine Towers are associated with runes, given that multiple demigods can share a two-finger location, such as Mohg and Morgoth's great runes. And then the second point is that these fingers are dead, and the state we find them in is after they've died. But we'll come back to all that. Now let's take a little bit and talk about Ranni's two fingers. We went really in depth on this in the video about Mantis Celeste, so I'll keep this part pretty brief, but these two fingers are very unique for a number of reasons. Number one, they're in a state between life and death. These fingers are afflicted by the curse mark of death, the half-wheel of the centipede, which likely contributes to their mangled form. They seem to be almost melting, fusing with the ground, which could be sort of a distorted version of them turning into wood, but they do still bleed unlike the others. Now, as we also mentioned in that video, Ranni's two fingers are one of the only ones that actively participate in the events of the game, presently using their powers to send a shadow of Blythe after Ranni, which is interesting considering the fingers of the Round Table hold do virtually nothing, and the ones atop the Divine Towers are dead. It makes you wonder why the others are so silent. But it also communicates one other thing to me, that they're able to act independently of the greater will. And then last but not least, we have the three fingers, somehow corrupted by the outer god of the frenzied flame. Just as the two fingers can choose Empyreans, the three fingers can choose a new host for the Lord of Frenzied Flame. However, they're sealed underground, and their powers contained until we break them free. It's never really explained why the three fingers exist, but we do know that in the lands between, 3 is considered an ill omen. The difference between the 2 and 3 fingers is much like Frampt and Koth from Dark Souls 1, where the 2 fingers or Frampt want you to continue the age, becoming the new lord, and Koth and the 3 fingers want you to put an end to it. They represent different philosophies about the way forward, and the player can choose to follow either one. But unlike the relationship between Frampt and Koth, the 2 fingers don't seem to know about the 3 fingers, and pay no mind if you inherit the Frenzied Flame, which I find interesting. But here's where we reach the edge of our understanding. Beyond what I've stated, we know almost nothing else about the fingers. We don't know their origins. We don't know their motivation. We don't even know if they were around before or after the Greater Will. And we're left with one question that encompasses all of it. Why? Why are they fingers? And why do they have their powers? The concept of fingers obviously plays a big role in the world of Elden Ring, given that the connection between the worlds of Tarnished are by fingers, with the quality of the finger determining how it affects the other's world. There are also the weird finger creepers, literal multi-fingered hands that wander the world as animals and raise enough questions of their own. But the single motif of fingers doesn't explain everything. It wasn't just a random choice. Now I gotta be honest with you guys, I've spent several months trying to answer that, unsuccessfully. I cannot tell you with certainty why they are fingers, but I can lead you on the path of speculation about this topic, and try to find what sounds the most reasonable. But the way I want to go about this is by looking outside of the game first, and exploring the concept at play here. I'm going to inject a little bit of personal bias when interpreting this, but the way I kinda understand how the fingers act primarily in Ranni's story, but it feels as if they're a bit of manipulators, telling the Tarnished what to do, aiming their followers, even hand-picking who becomes the god of the next age. And this is important when it comes to the speculation we're about to talk about. Much of Elden Ring's visual and even metaphorical design comes from an old hermetic scroll, an alchemical formula for the Philosopher's Stone told in imagery. Now we've covered this several times here on the channel. It was the source of a lot of investigation and speculation even prior to the game's release, but it does offer a good way of understanding the intention behind a lot of things that we can find, with of course the main inspiration being found in the depiction of the royal court, the wheel formula, and even the magnum opus at the bottom of the scroll being emblematic of the Elden Ring itself. But the reason I bring that up is because the most prominent figure on the scroll is the alchemist. And the alchemist is very much like the outer gods, in that if we assume the events of the game are the chemical reactions and the process being made in the formula, then the one on the outside guiding everything is the alchemist, or in our case, the greater will. And the way he works on the formula are by his hands or his fingers. And I think it would be very much like Miyazaki to make this literal, putting a giant grotesque pair of fingers as our means of determining the object of the mind of the one in control. Now of course that doesn't explain everything on this list. It doesn't even explain the laws of what what we find in game, and we still have other sources we could draw from. Perhaps it's a play on the idea of the hand of God that guides and determines fate, just as we mentioned earlier how the words have power even enough to manifest a sword, and they may even just be based on tree roots, or thinking that branches just might look like fingers and they took that literally. But to explain why they might be fingers in context of the game's world, I've got one theory that kinda makes sense and then one that's kinda ridiculous but also makes a lot of sense. The first involves the giant skeletons that we can find all throughout Caelid. If you're up to speed on the lore of Elden Ring, then you know that at one point there was a war with the giants, and that they were conquered before the age of the Erdtree. Now in order to further explain where I'm going with this, we have to realize two things. That there are some loose parts of the lore that describe the Erdtree as having life-giving properties, and we have to assume that these skeletons we can find in Caelid are these giants that were conquered. And if both of those are the case, then it's convenient that the fingers line up in size with these giant skeletons. So perhaps after these giants were slain and conquered, their fingers were removed and repurposed as messengers for the greater will. Now I'm not even going to attempt to explain all the holes in that theory right there, and the reasoning involved to come to that conclusion, but it's just a passing idea I've had while thinking about this. The only theory that has persisted in my time investigating the fingers, that I have actively tried to disprove but have been unable, is the mushroom theory. What this theory entails is that the fingers play the role that mushrooms play in relation to trees in the real world, and that the two fingers are based on a type of fungus known as the dead man's fingers. They look almost identical to what we can see in the game. And with Elden Ring's heavy use of the theme of decay and rebirth, and constant use of mushroom imagery throughout other parts of the game, let me explain why the fingers being mushrooms themselves would actually make a good degree of sense. For trees to thrive in their biosphere, they rely on something called the mycelial integrated root network, otherwise known as the common mycelial network. And essentially what this is a giant web of roots connecting to mycelium strands that also connect to mushrooms, where the mushrooms act as agents for the trees, sending and receiving signals to communicate the state of their biosphere in various ways. Very similar to what the fingers do for the Erdtree in the Greater Will. But in order for that to make sense, we have to assume that there is a mycelial network beneath the lands between. Well, considering that you cannot go anywhere in this game without finding roots of the Erdtree, I think that's very likely. It might also explain why the fingers appear battered and injured, given that Godwyn's Deathblight corpse is right at the heart of the roots in the network. Now, I did an extremely extensive deep dive into this theory and idea that goes far beyond even just the fingers, and I recommend you check that out right after this one. If I had to put all of this under one umbrella, it's almost as if the two fingers shouldn't exist in the world of this game. They're so out of place both physically and in the lore of the game that we have almost no idea what they even are or how they came to be. Perhaps we'll learn more about them in the DLC, given that it seems to pertain to Miquella, but until that time comes, we're pretty much stumped for ideas. Either way though guys, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see more Elden Ring content. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.